You're wearing the same boat. No, I'm good. I can get pictures as well. With Marshall again, and I'm in trouble again. It'll take long to get back. You can do it from the microphone. If you're comfortable. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome. It's a little strange to welcome people when you can't see their full face, but welcome anyway. I want to begin our beginning. Some things never change. I want to begin this afternoon by thanking with gratitude and respect and acknowledging that Beth David resides on the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples. Toronto is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been welcomed into its treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, and we pay our respects to the Mississauga of the New Credit. The Greater Toronto area where Beth David sits is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful we have the opportunity to learn and pray freely today and all days in this community. Welcome.
Good afternoon and Hag Sameach. I'm so pleased to see so many of you joining us today in the Tent of Peace and so many more of us joining by Zoom. If it weren't for the pandemic, we would all be meeting in the Sukkah, and hopefully next year we will be. My name is Corrine Berman and I'm the co-chair of the Beth David's Anti-Racism Committee. This committee was created just over a year ago to create an anti-racism statement and mandate for Beth David, to conduct anti-racism education and awareness building, to build relationships and alliances with other communities, and to act and create substantive change. And at this moment in time, given where we live, we feel compelled to act. How can we not get involved and take action when we have so often said never again? Over and over again, I've heard Indigenous leaders and elders say that the first step in reconciliation is to commit to lifelong learning of Indigenous peoples. So to become true allies, we first need to listen and learn. And the more I learn, the more I realize how many similarities there are between our communities, our strength, our resilience, and how we honor and celebrate what this beautiful earth provides to us. Sukkot, our festival celebrating the harvest, seemed like the perfect holiday to come together. I also want to remind you that this Thursday, September 30th, is the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, also known as Orange Shirt Day. There are many ways you can honor this day. I encourage you to learn more about the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. You can research why Orange Shirt has become a submittal of residential school abuses, attend a virtual webinar, and if you're comfortable, join us at Dundas Square to honor Indigenous survivors with the Matriarchal Circle. And now I'd like to turn it over to Marsha Mashinsky, who is working tirelessly on this program, to introduce our most honored guest. Marsha.
Thank you, Corrine and Madeline. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Eric Johnston to the Beth David community today. Eric Johnston is from Ogichita Communications. He will be sharing more about himself and his background throughout this presentation. We are happy that Eric comes to us from the Chippewas of Nawash, Nashigaminning First Nation, which is located in the Bruce Peninsula. In his presentation today, Eric will be doing some ceremony. And I spoke earlier this week with an Anishinaabe community representative who, to highlight the importance of performance ceremony, he's mentioned, and to paraphrase an elder, he said, "Performance ceremony for any undertaking is good medicine. Even if the agenda is short, ceremony in and of itself is good." So we look forward in sharing some good ceremony with you, Eric, today. Thank you, Miigwech. And for the audience, please note that we'll stop the recording during the drumming and the singing. So there will be a few short pauses, although I know that we have an excellent moderator here to help facilitate the process. The live Zoom will also continue. So without further ado, Eric, I'll give you the floor. Miigwech.
Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here with you today. I hope I can live up to all the kind introductions that people have given so far. Maybe some way of explanation in terms of the worldview that I'm presenting from today is that the song I'll be singing for you, so it's just called a spirit world song. There's different societies that carry these songs, but they're more protected and they're more used in certain kinds of settings. The one I'll be singing today is a Thunderbird Song to start the groove off with, and it's I can give a little bit in terms of, you'll hear some way high, high. You'll hear some of our language in it as well. You'll hear some thunder in it. You'll hear the Thunderbird crying. It's a naming ceremony song, and we'll get a little bit deeper into that. Like it'll be, I guess the bigger objective here is to give you more to work with to kind of understand why and we hold these things so dearly, and the importance that they play in helping us understand how the world is organized. Not only how the world is, how the universe is organized. So if I could get the recording to stop, and I'll get us started with this song. Well, that was the first part, I guess, to ask for the spirits to reside. I think that's probably where we'll end up with it as well. I wanted to ask for some assistance from Marcia to. I'm trying to pull up the PowerPoint. I did a PowerPoint, and I was sharing with Marcia that a couple of years ago when I first started developing these PowerPoints, I started to like people would talk about worldviews, they would talk about identity, they would talk about constitutional rights, they would talk about a whole range of things, and we would. I'd always say, you know, that doesn't really go far enough. People aren't being given enough information. That discussing a worldview is not the first thing that people do in the morning. It's not when you have a cup of coffee with your friend or whoever. Worldviews are very rarely discussed. And so we never really examined what information we've been given to try to explain stuff and how we got here. And I wanted to spend time with you today to start to explore. And again, there's a professor out there, his name is Bruce Morito. He's an environmental philosopher. And way back in the day when we were working with our, for the tribes that we were doing research, and we had biologists and we had constitutional lawyers and we had litigation lawyers and we had communications people and we had resource economists and we had the one that made sense out of all of them was this philosopher. And he was saying, well, you can have a crooked lawyer. That doesn't, you can have a crooked biologist, or you can have a crooked economist. Whatever his values are that are powering his discipline and how he uses his training, he says it's really what makes a difference. And so we got into this standing around, we're all saying, like, why? Like, how does, and he says, so we said, well, where do values come from? How did they get shaped? How do these values get informed and handed over to the next generation of people? And once we got this first conversation, we said, well, he ended up doing a whole book on it. He wrote a book on it. And he explained a lot of the history. And you almost have to talk about it in terms of it's a mental experience of humanity that we end up talking about. Out of all the different races and out of all the different people that have walked the earth over these thousands and thousands of years, that there are certain forces that were shaping people's perception of things and how they would organize. And that's really kind of at the center of this talk this afternoon that I'll be giving. And that's kind of like the first couple of, many of us have received these facts and these interpretations in our childhood. And we just kind of accept them and say, okay, well, that we stopped believing that the world was flat and we found out it was round. And so we begin to accept other facts. And again, we don't really, a lot of these we may have internalized so deeply and lived with so long, we don't realize how big of an impact and influence it's having in terms of how we perceive things and how we perceive others. So anyways, that was, I'm going to take a risk here and try to move on to the next one. And that didn't work, so we're going page down now. So
Next slide.
let me see, yeah, well, here we go. And again, that's a little bit more of what I was talking about in terms of we rely on this perception that our mom and dad and our grandparents gave us. And most of it comes in pretty handy because it helps us know the world and it helps interpret our experiences in the world. The society, whatever society we find ourselves in, even in my own home community, they perform some kind of custodial function to make sure that we've got somewhat of a basic idea of what knowledge really, what it is, what's questionable knowledge, what is accurate knowledge. There's, again, the whole idea is to begin to move into this presentation. We'll start to question, where did the colonizers' worldview come from? What shaped it? What events were happening within Europe that began to shape their understanding that would lead to their perceptions of others in terms of how they would achieve economies, all these kind of like bigger questions. And so I developed, I'm kind of proud of this one, only because you got the eyeball there. You got the eyeball there, and it's the shape of the earth, and it's got the earth, so it kind of gives you the worldview type of flavor that I'm looking for. Worldviews are informed by human experiences, major events, powerful institutional views dominating and interpreting centuries of domestic life, remembered that is as inherited group memory, history. examining worldview is also an examination of a variety of histories in psychology, land use, religions, science, political, economic ideologies, histories of war, histories of law, where laws come from. There's only one discipline that deals with all of these knowledges, and that one is philosophy. And it was kind of by way of Bruce, we were Bruce Morito again. We were saying, well, he says, no, back in the, and even in the Middle Ages, he says, like, religion was science. Religion was also backed militarily. Religion was well guarded, was really protected. He says you've got such as an institution, it's very powerful. People are going to the church or going into ceremony with the church 3-4 times a day. And he says, so there's a very powerful institution that exists for a very long period of time, and that has a major influence in terms of how people are understanding the world and how it is organized. So this is a very philosophical conversation. And to start with, we'll start off with a question. like, who am I? Why am I up here waving my arms around thinking I can talk about all this stuff? And why are you here? And I think that we've come to a time and a place in humanity's story. Maybe for Indigenous people, we've spent all kinds of time in the courts. We've spent all times in blockades, but we're starting to come to a place where people are saying, well, given the amount of weather we've been having of late, there might be something to what these people are saying. You've got science on one side of our knowledge, in our knowledge tree, that's saying certain things, certain effects are happening. There's certain causes that are a cause and effect that's happening. And so that's one branch of knowledge that people are starting to weigh in their thoughts, become more aware of. You got Indigenous people talking about a sacred relationship with the land. You've got them talking about that you need this kind of relationship to exist between man and the land, or probably things aren't going to go so well, or going to keep going the way they're going. And so, although I can't get into as deeply as I wanted to, back in Europe times, tribal ancestors, whether they were Irish, English, French, Spaniards, they would had tribal ways. They were oral societies. They would go into ceremony and into the woods. They would go into the woods and make offering and try to appease, ask for permission to do things. And so to relate that to today, Indigenous people still believe that's one of the values we need, is to go back out there and ask for that permission. Because when we don't ask for permission, there are no limits. There's none. We will assign these values to natural environments, and we will do whatever we want to those natural environments, because we don't believe that there's a spiritual qualities in these other beings that make up nature, make up the environment. And I'm thinking this is one of those opportunities where we get to see each other and we hear each other. And I'd like to thank you again for inviting me here today. I'm trying to inject a little bit of humor into some of these into these slides, guys. I just wanted to me to be putting along here and giving this monotone. But in terms of when I was developing this, people got very strong commitments to knowledges that they've accepted and have been working with. And you almost just can't think them away. You got to make a real deliberate attempt to say, I think we should be questioning that idea a little bit more. And so here's my attempt at some humor in this, in terms of how we commit to ideas, and we'll try to make the facts fit to our perception. The other one is how much history people really have. How much time have people been given to really understand history? The history of military, the history of religion, the history of environment, the history of agriculture, the history, all these different histories are part of the human experience. Within this experience is economic ideology. Now, I didn't really know anything about economic ideologies more than being a fisher person from a community, and actually that was one of my opportunity to introduce myself a little bit more, and I think I'll go back to that. My background is I've got a degree in history. I've got another diploma in legal office administration. It kind of prepared me to give some kind of analysis in history, political analysis. I got involved with a 5-year national Indian control of Indian education study. I got a pretty good view nationally in terms of what the education systems, what shape they were in First Nation communities. Some were very big, very elaborate, some of them pretty small. Did land claim research. I did a lot of addition research. I did land title research. So it's kind of like I've got a number of these work experiences that I'm borrowing from to help me make sense in my own perception of how the world got organized. Anyways, back to the earlier slide. One of those is ideology, and they exist together, a worldview and the ideology that people have been asked to accept without even really questioning it, to just kind of to fit into it. Everybody, one phrase I heard, because I watch Democracy Now, and one of the ladies was talking about, well, it wasn't that they came to Afghanistan to introduce us to capitalism. He says we only became beggars to capitalism. And they kind of say, well, geez, I'm going to use that. That sounds pretty good. But it kind of cuts it to a perception that we're going to be working more and more towards as we move along here. I guess a centerpiece to this is just exactly this, is that all of us have worldviews. All of us have been influenced by a certain economic ideology. That ideology has moved us from mankind seeing himself as part of the environment to where he is the namer of values to all the other parts of environment. And that's a major transition that has taken centuries for that to slide into place. And that it seems such a natural evolution to probably a lot of the perceptions that people are just inheriting. Say this is how it is. This is can't escape it. We may as well go along with it. And the only ones who are really on the front line say, well, we're drinking a lot of polluted water up here. We're having a lot of bushfires over here. We're having, there's a lot of serious repercussions that are coming out of how this economic ideology is working and the social order that it has created. How are they different? I was kind of unsure on how. What I call this is that I'm pushing the lens in closer so that there's more detail starts to show up. Other parts of this presentation, I'll start to pull the lens out further. And so you get a more of a worldview or a bigger view covering more centuries. This one is this. I'm going to have my friend show up here, and there's my friend right there. And just really try to ask some practical questions. I know I'm throwing a lot of information up on the screens here, and I'm trying to do my best to try to unpack it in a way that it's comprehensive, digestible. How do worldviews and economic ideologies coexist in the same society, in the same community? How do I experience them in my life, and I guess your life, and our kids' lives are going to experience them as well? And how they're going to be interpreting my experiences in the world. They're going to be interpreting how I know the world. I made one emphasis is that ideologies are trying to always shape and control worldviews that each generation is hoping expected to embrace. I did some research in terms of how do we identify the difference between economic ideologies and worldviews. Constant perception of reality is one. Like I'll give you a bit of time to go. It's attitudes, it's beliefs. It's a constant mental view that certain truths in reality exist. The other one is more of it's a conformity to a social order. It's that's an economic idea. It's an enforced expected action that you're expected to take. Economic goals are often institutionally backed. The other one is, and I kind of always try to, if we're talking about inequality, there's always a promise that all will be included. After so many years down the road, you find out most of the people, the majority, have been excluded out of this ideology. And so, on to the next one. And again, I kind of know that this is all a lot of information, and I apologize for that. And so I'm just trying to regroup and connect to where this talk is going. And to do that, I'm going to ask for Alex Baldwin to give us a talk in terms of information, education, and the roles that education is expected to play for us.
A baby's not born with any idea of a society, no sense whatever of other people. Its mother exists principally, in fact entirely, for him or her, and its father exists somewhat later, entirely for him or her. It's only much, much later that the baby begins to realize that the parent on whom he depended for everything and whom he supposed held up the world is in fact just another human being who was not invented for him. That is, on the most primary level, one of the meanings of an education. On another level, it is the only way that one is enabled to enlarge the world. Now that sounds like a very grandiose phrase. All it means is that when you, for example, begin to read, you discover more about the world than you knew before. You discover more about the world in two ways, and this is why it is important. There being, in fact, two worlds. One world is you. That this envelope, I'm a world. I'm not the only world, that's my problem. But I am a world, and I'm under the obligation to discover whatever it is that goes on in that world. And in order to do that, I have got to consent to become a social animal in order to discover and to enlarge what goes on in this world, which is all of you and many millions of people, both living and dead, past and to come. And finally, this is where it begins to be difficult, the measure of one's dignity depends on one's estimate of oneself. It really does not depend, as so many people in this country now seem to believe, on someone else's estimate. It depends, first of all, on what you take yourself to be, what your real standards are, what you think is right, what you think is wrong, what you think life is all about, what you think life is for. Now, you are all very young. And I say that, by the way, with great humility. You are all still unformed. Or let me put it another way, you are not finally formed. And you are still, to put it brutally, I want to put it brutally because I want to make my point absolutely clear. You are still at the mercy of your elders. You are still at the mercy of the standards of your elders. Let us go back again to the whole concept of education. And bear in mind, then, that education does not and cannot occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a social context. It occurs in a social context, and it has social ends. For example, to take a very brutal example, the children of the Third Reich were educated by the Third Reich in order to fulfill the purposes of the Third Reich. Hitler did this on a very old principle, the principle referred to by priest and in the Bible, and which every parent somewhere knows. If you give me the child for 5 years, I'll have him the rest of his life. So that if that is so, one has then got to be aware that one of the purposes of an education, your responsibility before your educators, is to question the purpose of this education. Let me give you then, your education is occurring within a given context, at a certain time in history, in a certain country, at a certain time in its history. In fact, at a very crucial time in its history.
So with James Baldwin, I see it at the end of his life when he talks about giving the children for the first 5 years of their life and how much influence you will have if you're the educator of those children. That's the residential school. Like in terms of the indigenous experience, that was some of the logic, the strategy that was being employed to break that connection between the parents and children. The ability for people to foster a strengthened identity among the next generation. And they kind of understood that had to be interfered with, that had to be intruded on. So anyways, I'm trying to round this out into, we're going to go deeper into, again, more and more history's coming. I don't know how else to unpack some of this. But the whole idea of a social order model of conformity to inequality is an economic system that can be found at the center of all European or Europe's civilizations, either as a primary feature or as a revised founding principle dictating the economic order that existed in each century. It all starts within Rome. you know, and again, before I started really looking into this, I had some idea about Rome, but I didn't realize how powerful of an impact it had throughout Europe and all the other centuries that would follow, even after Rome no longer existed, that a lot of the thinking survived in terms of the social order that began with this group. And it survived long enough to become part of the settler experiences in the 1600s. It extended itself into the nation state and how the nation states would organize themselves. Pretty tricky stuff, I guess. Like the strength that I see in this model is how it was able to combine worldview, religion, class privileges, domestic laws, and the use of violence. Not violence all the time either. It wasn't, but all of it promoting, merging to create conformity to an inequality. You know, some of this, the history starts to describe this conformity as something that society is evolved out of, and we no longer do that. We're no longer organized like that. But when you start to look more closely at the structures of the societies, they're pretty much operating on the same principles. I put the one at the bottom here, centuries later, indigenous people would understand this. This is what it is when we're talking about assimilation. Is that the segregation caused by the Indian Act, all of those things had political strategies powering them. There was definite outcomes that were being searched for. This whole idea of conformity within European and American societies. The game wasn't just played on indigenous people. It was played on females as well. There's this whole idea of inequality it exists, and we're just not aware of it. I mean, we don't think of it. It's just so natural that it's often goes unquestioned. Anyways, I don't want to lose you, so I want to keep going here. Again, it's we're talking about three. We got this guy that my friend showing up again asking these questions. You know, okay, what does all what are the three major, out of all the different histories you could talk about, what are the three cornerstones to building this worldview perception that I'm going on up here about? And these are them. One is centuries of natural environmental exploitation to achieve economy. I'm not talking about just cutting trees. There's all kinds of examples in terms of, as science started to uncover gunpowder. Everybody was in the countryside digging up the elements to find gunpowder. Okay, we know how to make metal. The countryside is getting dug up then to find metal. And there's a constant going after the environment to not only create economy, but there's other forces that are pushing it as well. Centuries of versions of a founding social order. That's the second one. The third one is that you have centuries of a military religious action towards animistic worldviews, the views that plants, animals, elements of the earth also have spiritual qualities. And it was promoted, this view was promoted in Roman times, feudal times. It was also heavily promoted within colonial times in North America. So we're going to start to look at a little, again, I'm pushing the lens in closer to look a little more detail. And I'll only doing three, so I won't put you through all the others that are possible here. But deforestation. There's a couple of slides that are coming up, and I wanted to not lose sight of that we're not just talking about the cutting down of trees. We're talking about real biodiversity strength in environments. That the grass that was being taken out of the picture as agricultural products were being, new ways to do agriculture were being brought in, that these were the strengths that could handle, these are the strengths of the environment that could go through these hard times and still survive, still have a resilience that would allow them to bounce back from. And those grasses are going like 6 or 7 feet into the ground. New crops, maybe 6 inches, so they're a little more vulnerable. To give you a better view of what it is I'm talking about, this is Europe back. And I was so lucky to come across this one study. It gives you an idea of just how much force was in Europe in these times. 1,000 years BC, you go up, you're starting to see deforestation start to have its impact. Populations are starting to boom. Again, 100 years go by, you start to see more of this type of decimation taking place. By the time the 1500s roll around, we got more. By the time by the time that Christopher Columbus is crossing the ocean, people don't really even have wood to heat their meals with. Most of the people are, there's hardly any fish in the water, in the streams. There's been so much pressure being put on natural systems that people can't live on the countryside anymore. That kind of pushes them into the cities. The cities are not really equipped to handle them. It is also a major push to empire building. Why France, Spain are all crossing the oceans to look for other lands. So there's a real powerful push to begin to find resources that they no longer have within their own territories. Finally, you get into North America, and this is what you find. You find all this biodiversity and tremendous strength. I met a lot of people, I imagine, have seen this picture or similar pictures to it. But if you look closely, that's a cedar tree. And cedar trees, you know, they're as big as the sequoias, they're as big as the redwoods. It's kind of like coming into the Star Wars forest where all these gigantic trees, but this entire coast, if not the whole North America, is full of these types of trees. And every region that you go to across Canada, you look at the pictures in the early times, like you're going to see these are the trees that are being taken out. So actually, this is also the economic order reestablishing itself again. First thing that a lot of the settlers start to say is, well, the first thing we got to do is we got to cut these trees down. You know, so it's kind of the social order, the economic ideology starts to reassert itself. It starts to revise itself and reassert itself again. The second, models of conforming inequality and discrimination and social class systems. Certainly the Romans had it going on. Feudal England, feudal times had it going on. They had this social order happening. Settler times, it's the indentured servants now and the plantation owners. That's the difference. That's the difference between power, how much political might each group has, what kind of benefits they're going to see out of this social order, what kind of physical mobility they have, socially and physically, in terms of where you can be and where you can't be. You've got pretty much the same thing starting to appear in today's politics, in terms of a lot of the politics that are within the states. Again, I don't want to go too hard on that. And again, this is my poor attempt at humor in terms of trying to come at it. And another way to say, these are all different ideologies. And all of these ideologies are based on conforming to some kind of form of inequality. Again, I'm kind of fast forwarding through some of this. I'm wanting to get in more of the cultural content later on. I wanted to, again, like just some of these facts that I'm coming across are just like, out of the 60 million that were in Europe back in Rome, 1 in 5 could be pretty much identified as a slave. You even got up to 1 in 3. So you're talking about a tremendous amount of people, but its success was not so much that they could stand over someone with a spear. It was that they had a way they could offer Roman citizenship to somebody. They offered them, you learn to speak our language. You attend some of our protocols in terms of our norms. You fight in some of our armies. There's a chance that you're going to be given Roman citizenship at some point. Now that doesn't mean that you get to hang out with the emperor and sit around with your emperor and say, well, hey, what are we going to do about Cleopatra and the Egyptians? You don't. Your role is you're going to be building Rome's roads. You're going to be making sure that your oil goes into the capital. That's going to be your role within the empire. You're not going to get all the glossy rights. You start to, again, I felt that there was some informational purpose here. Invasions would lead to an occupation. This occupation would turn into a closely monitored domestic type of social dominance. This social dominance would exist for a while until even the people who were being conquered could not go back to their own lands because they were already made dependent on the central system. And even if they did go back to their own lands, those lands would already be in the possession of somebody else. And so there was no place to go back to. You were dependent on this system, and that's kind of what the process was about. Your choice was to either to adapt, adopt, or perish. Those were your choices. Your politics were reduced to bread and water, issues of bread and water. Not unlike First Nation communities. This is, I'll keep echoing this as we go on to say this is exactly the type of dependency that was being fostered and caused by this tragedy that was being employed at the time. So is to some degree. I only threw this in there to say even after feudal times, as we moved into that, even after the wheels came off the Roman Empire, that other groups would try to take the void that was created by Rome's disappearance. And there would be just all kinds of battles, people just trying again to reestablish their own dominance, their own dependency with other groups. The third one, and again, this is only limited to 3, that is centuries of military action against animistic belief, worldviews that were held by groups who were being, at this point, and you've got this idea just kind of shows a sharp distinction between the two, that the two are at odds with each other. I talked to Marcia about this one, and I'm hoping that's not as illegible. Kind of messed up this one, but the idea that I wanted to lay the two creation stories beside each other One is an Anishinaabe creation story. The other one is more of a Christianity creation story. Both of them are very similar in a lot of ways. There's a lot of common points. The whole idea that with Christianity was that man was made from the land. Like he was taken from the land and shaped into a being that some of it gets into a little bit different in that they say, well, it was made in God's image. That God's image is actually mankind's image. This kind of gets reinforced centuries, thousands of years later with the arrival of Jesus, who also happens to be in man's or human form. But what it does is it starts to create this divide between man as a spiritual person and creation as a spiritual community, and that man has his own spiritual community and the nature spiritual community over there somewhere that man can't be doesn't have access to. And that's really all I'm trying to get at this to try to say that the indigenous worldview continue with the commitment that we are so dependent on the physical and spiritual vitality of the natural world, and that we really do not know our own place in creation without their help. This power is more within women, because women already share the life-giving forces of the earth, and they're more, and men have to work a little bit harder. Men kind of lose their way a lot of the time, but women, they're connected to all those forces already. And so men, in terms of their spiritual relationship, have to work a little bit harder. There's a little bit more that they have to do in order to harmonize with these other forces. When I go into this, I beat up on Rome quite often in this presentation, but it's more with Constantine, and again, there's can be debates and other things in terms of Mr. Constantine, but he starts off as a pagan. He ends up being a Christian, but somewhere in that transition, Christianity starts to pick up institutional backing, and not just institutional backing, military backing. And so they start to focus in on other groups that have animistic belief systems, and they start to eradicate those. And you start to see that this also becomes a view that the colonizers inherit when they come to North America, and it starts to explain the adversarialness between First Nations people and colonizers' views in terms of the world and how it's organized. And that's really all I'm trying to get at, is to identify these three powerful perceptions that are interwoven and they combine, but they create the worldview that starts to be so at odds with how Indigenous people are understood to be. They're backwards. They're not. And we certainly can't get them to conform to inequality, but they constantly see themselves as committed to this other perception. And I wanted to put this here only because I wanted to re-emphasize that Irish people, English people, French people, Italian people, all the people of the Europe also had these belief systems. Before the Romans showed up, people were, pretty much had ceremonial ways. They had their traditions that they were sticking to. And so it's just kind of to try and say that Indigenous people aren't introducing something so new that it was not heard of before. In fact, there's a lot of commonness in terms of what Indigenous people are trying to say today in terms of what are the new values, what is the relationship that humanity now has to start to consider. And again, if you look for Lynn White Jr., he was kind of like a heavyweight back in his day in terms of the intellectual people that were looking at these issues. He comes up with at least these are a couple of things that I stole out of his work. You know, despite these scientists that made all these breakthroughs in terms of the universe, we continue to think that everything revolves around our little Earth, right? Where it doesn't. There's so much more that's out there. And despite Darwin, we do not, in our own hearts and our own minds, we're not able to see ourselves as part of a natural process. That we are connected to this Earth in very, very fundamental ways. And I guess maybe I should start to put more emphasis in that. The song that I sang at the beginning of the, I had been a singer for quite a while, 8 or 9 years, and I ran into this one elder, and I knew him. I would see him at gatherings, and I said, you know, that guy. If I had a chance to sit and talk with that guy. Anyways, I heard he was in Ottawa, and I was working in Ottawa at the time, and he was at this art gallery with his son. And they had their drum down there, so I made every day I was down there singing with them and picking up their songs. And so after about 4 or 5 days, he turns to me and he says, why don't you come and live with me? He says, I'll teach you how to really sing. I was, being all proud of myself. I already know how to sing. And he goes, no. He says, I'll teach you how to really sing. And so I said, coming from you, I said, if I ever had a chance, I would leave tomorrow with you. If I had a chance to do something like that. And within 2 weeks, my boss said, they're looking for a zone consultant up in Kenora, north of Lake of the Woods. He says, would you be interested in going? I said, yeah. I said, yeah, I'll go. So I had my Z28 with a T-bird roof on it. And everything I owned was in the back of that car, and I'm flying up on my way up to Kenora. And I went and lived with them for a couple of years. And what they talk about is half of the song, way high, A high. He said, we may not know what that is. We don't know why your spirit's like that. They like those sounds now. He says, but those words are in there for us. And he says, so when you sing the way high A stuff, he says that's when the spirits come in. And he says, and your mom and dad or your grandparents are with them. And they're there. He says, so, but when you sing the word parts, he says, you're putting the two together. And so we really are in those moments back with our ancestors. And he says, like the songs that you hear, he says, the way high, he says, all that is the shape of the land. He says, that's why the Sioux songs are different. That's why the Navajo songs are different. That's why the Kiowa songs are different. They're all different because of the lands that they come from, the shape of the lands. And he said, it's the lands themselves that shape those songs. And so you start to get these pieces that are falling into place in terms of a worldview that I'm desperately trying to bring or find the pieces for. And he says that they would continue to go on, and he says, after us being here for thousands and thousands of years, he says, and living and dying and being put in the ground, and us living again, and he says, and then we get put back in the ground. He says, we become part of that. And he says, so our people are so in love with this land. He says that intimacy that's talked about is that sacred relationship. It ends up being so intimate, it ends up being a sacred relationship. And he says the other part is that because our mom and dads and our parents love this land so much, he says, they'll never leave. They'll never leave this land. He says, so you got both the land, and he says, and your ancestors, again, as part of that communion that's happening. He says that's and what makes that relationship work is that they love the land. The ancestors love their kids. The kids love their ancestors. He says that's what makes it work. So again, like you get all these little pieces that are starting to fit together, and you start to say, well, okay, now I'm starting to understand what the sacred relationship is. And I could go into other parts of that, but I'll get into some of that a little bit later on. We get a little bit into this. This is kind of like in the more of the political side of things, legal side. I just wanted to put it in there to start to say that this starts to find its way in terms of the discovery theory. A lot of the plantation owners are using land charters based on what the Papa Bulls were saying. And we are back. Now we can start to talk about the Indigenous worldview. How am I doing for time? Am I overcooking this?
About 50 minutes.
Yeah, I can wrap it up. I want to leave time for people to have questions as well. I'll go back to this. When you see that, in addition to it having nice artwork, and, those are bang on colors kind of stuff. What you see is when you see these animals and their spirit bodies, that's what they look like. And I know it may be a little tricky for some people, but at certain times I've had these visions, at certain times other people have had these insights, and you'll have this dream or you'll have this vision, and when you're starting to see the animals in your dream, they'll look like that. They'll have all these purples, these yellows, these oranges, these reds, and they're all moving within inside of each other. And then you start to realize when Nobel, Marceau, and all these other artists, that's what they're drawing. That's what's powering this expression. And I was down in San Francisco, and I was giving a talk pretty much like the one I'm giving today. And I said, who knows why this art is the way it is? And there's this guy from way up in Alaska, this great big trapper, and he goes, because that's how the animals look in this, from when you see them in the spirit world. I said, yeah. So here we got like two people thousands of miles apart from each other, but that sight is there, that perception is there, without us even saying anything to each other. Like, it's just kind of like, okay, this guy's got the gift. You can stay. So I just, I'll give one more clip, and just again, to kind of broaden it out a bit, to say this is not, Indigenous people do not necessarily have a monopoly on this. And the one person that I could find that was kind of saying the same thing, and I'm thinking that she's worth listening to.
Hi, it's Michelle Medrano. Welcome to another episode of Contemplate This. If you want to get a cup of coffee or tea or something and join me for this one, feel free. It's like we're going to have a little coffee together, because today we're going to give you a metaphysical crash course, 3 to 5 minutes. So here we go. So what is metaphysics? What does it mean to be metaphysical? So you probably are aware, many of you, that metaphysical means beyond the physical. It's a word that invites a contemplation and awareness of that which is beyond the physical. Often people get very caught up in the physical world, the world of the senses, and allow that world to dictate what's so. And while there are facts and there are events and there are conditions and situations, to be metaphysical means to look at those facts and situations and still contemplate and pay attention to how we're being in relationship to those facts and those situations. It's the example of somebody who's standing before some challenge in their life and being very caught up in the frustration of what appears to be so, or getting to the place where they can find actually gratitude for the things that have occurred that allowed them to be safe, or allowed them to start something new, or allowed them to see things differently or have a new experience. And all of that is born out of the ability to discern and to begin to see life from more than just the physical reality. So in metaphysical teachings, a huge part of that is an understanding and a belief that there is a power and a presence in this universe. Some call it God, some call it infinite intelligence, but it's everywhere. It's woven itself into every part of creation, that which is physical and that which is beyond the physical. It's the air that we breathe. It's the solid things that we see. It's the people. It's the conditions. It is woven itself through all of creation. That's the metaphysical belief about the divine. And it's woven itself through each one of us. So we believe that each one of us is an expression of this energy, that if it's everywhere present, it must be right here where I am. It's not like the universe would say, well, I'm going to be everywhere except where that Michelle person is because I don't like her. It doesn't.
Anyways, I like this lady. I wanted to include this one. And again, I'll ask, well, how am I doing for time? Because I wanted to.
45 minutes.
What, how?
45.
45 minutes?
Yeah.
Great. I'll go into one story then. When I was living up in Kenora, and when we talk about this sacred relationship, and it was at a time, again, this is when I've already been up in Kenora, had all my belongings. It was like 40 below out, and we were getting out of wood. So I was, and the elder sons, they weren't really ready yet. And I was saying, well, I'm in a worse spot than they had. I need this wood. And so we got the logs all down, and I took off down there with the truck by myself, and I'm walking through snow about like up to here, and I'm carrying these there's forest fires, woods, but all the trees just don't burn to nothing. There's all forests that are still standing there with all these trees, but the wood is kill dried already. So when we cut it up, we're cutting it into like logs like this, and I'm coming out of the snow with all this. And it was so cold out that I was sweating, and I had an icicle stuck to the end of my chin. But I really needed this wood, so I spent like the next 4 hours trying to get all these logs out onto the road. And just by the time I got all the logs, that's when the guy showed up, right? And the elder cattle lives there. He says, just go and sit in the truck. He says, well, we got this. Like, I said, oh, okay. So we get back, and again, it was we were going into a cold snap. So he says, well, it's going to be cold, so I get the chainsaw out some more. We start cutting it. It was so cold that you could spit into the snow and you could just hear it crackle. It was just kind of like, so of course, like, that's not going to happen to us. We're going to get this wood inside the house. And so that's what I did, was I filled up the stove that we had. I couldn't fit another piece of wood in there, and I said, well, This is how it's going to go. And all I had was this like little jail cot almost. I was renting this room, and I was so bushed. I just went and laid down in the cot, and I was just felt like I was going off to sleep, and I don't know, whatever I thought I could hear, but I opened my eyes and I looked at the doorway, and there was these two spirits come sliding like right into the room. One, they're both about 6'3", 6'4", like dark skin. Their eyes are just like charcoal black, that just like shiny. And it was all I could do to kind of like look at them. And I was looking, and I was scared. I was like frightened right out of my tree. Like I was like there's nothing I could explain to say like you're not supposed to be here. And then the lady, spirit, she leans forward and she looks at me and she says, "Don't be scared." Like she's speaking Indian. "Don't be Zegas." Like don't be scared. And then the man leans forward and he says, "Yes," he says, we're here to show you something. And the lady says, "Yes, we want you to hear this." And then they said, "Listen to this." And they both started singing. And so as soon as that sound came out, it hit the floor, it hit the ceiling, it was hitting the walls, it grabbed that bed I was in and it was shaking that bed across the floor. And I was kind of like I was scared. I said, this is it. This is where I die. Anyways, I could feel that sound start to go inside my mouth. And it was just kind of like I was so terrified. And then finally it was just like peace. It was just like I was laid down in a warm water, and I remember just laying there and I was just smiling to myself and I was thinking, there's nothing better than this. I've never felt anything like this. Like nothing. There was nothing I experienced. And I just remember like I was laying there just smiling to myself, and all of a sudden it just like quit. And I sat up in my bed and I was yelling at the top of my voice, like, "Don't leave me here. I want to go with you. I don't want to stay here. Like, let me go with you." And then I was gone. I was just kind of like sitting there by myself, and I was thinking, wow, it happened. It's true. All the things that we've said about our ancestors are having us a sacred relationship to the land in terms of us being able to be visited by spirits, in terms of all of that is true. And how all that got misunderstood of what that is. And really what that was, I could tell that those spirits were connected to the thousands of other people that had lived and died that somehow are part of my story, my people's story. And so when we talk about this sacred relationship, in essence, the foundation of it is this is what we're talking about. This is what's powering it. This is what's allowing us to be reinvigorated, be re-empowered, be reinvested with this worldview, to say that this is how the world is organized. So when you start to when you look at even the lips of these characters that are in this one picture, when they come to sing with you, that's exactly how they look. Like they're using exactly everything that they got in their throat and in their mouth, and they're pushing that sound out. And so what you have is the songs that we're singing is trying to mimic those songs, those sounds, because those are the sounds that they're coming to give to us. These are the songs. There's other teachings that they will give to you. There's other understandings that they will also start to give to you. So it's not just a one-directional conversation. it's an interactive conversation. When we go into ceremony, we have this back and forth. It ends up being like a communion, I guess. So when you have this happen, that I think somewhere along the line, John Lane McDonald must have figured it out to say, you know, we gotta interrupt this relationship with the land, because these people will keep reinventing themselves. They will keep reconnecting themselves to these powers, or to this understanding, or to this worldview. And so when you start to realize that, then the residential school system and what happened in there starts to make more sense, and why it had to become so heavy-handed the way that it did. And you know, although there may be some newspapers across the country that want to downplay the severity of what was going on in there, I feel comfortable today, you know, so kind of like, it is about our uncles being woke up in the middle of the night to go and bury bodies somewhere in the forest. It is about our uncles getting attacked in the kitchen because they didn't want to get raped, getting hit across the head with a frying pan. It is about kids who are working in the kitchen watching a nun come down from a newly born baby from one of the priests, from one of the girls, and watching that infant thrown into the fireplace and into the stove. You know, it is about girls laying in their dormitory, and it says seeing people that were not even from the institution itself, just somebody who walked into the school, would shop and grab one of the girls and just walk off with her and never see her again. And it's not just one generation that's telling these stories. They're saying this is what's been happening since these schools were brought into existence. And you, it's not that these kids were blind. They knew there was murder. They knew this stuff was going on. They knew who did the murder. They knew that they were not in a good place, and that they were hundreds and hundreds of miles away from their parents or anybody that could do anything about it. So you get you come to the school at 5 years old. You don't understand English. They're talking to you in English. You get caught speaking Indian. Well, you get this spanking from a stranger. That episode, adrenaline is already going into the major muscle groups of the child. Cortisol hormones are already in the body. It's amping up the senses. It's making your eyes a lot more acute to what it is that your hearing is amped up. These are all natural survival mechanisms that come into play when your person is under threat. And what that does is it ends up burning a really profound memory into your mind. You will not soon forget that memory because of how hot that memory, what went into creating that memory by these hormones being introduced into your system. And what I'm really kind of describing out of my years working in residential treatment center is I've had an opportunity to get a fairly good sense like what is trauma, like how. So you have one episode where you get the spanking for speaking your language. Maybe a couple, maybe it has to happen again. Same kind of trauma takes place. Pretty soon, it's just the look from that person that's going to turn you to fall into line. That you already, the adrenaline's back in your body, already the cortisol's back in your body again. because that's all it takes is for you to remember what you survived, and you can't stop that. You cannot stop these hormones finding their way into your system when your person is being put into the system. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing the lens in really close to what the trauma was, and to try to give a deeper or fuller sense of what the residential school was as a mental experience, not just with one generation or one day, but for a number of generations that had to experience this. So that's kind of where I'm wanting to bring it to a full stop. And I don't want to leave it there. Like there's other parts that I want to add, but I'm just trying to kind of follow some of the conversation that me and Marcia had as we were trying to say what could get covered, what could be part of this talk, what should be part of this talk. But I do have some other stories that I could kind of convey. Do people need a bio break, or that's kind of late in asking? Everybody's been.
Maybe a stretch.
Maybe a stretch. Okay. Give each other 5 minutes to get a stretch, and then go down the. Thank you for listening. I mean, yeah, you've been very kind and patient.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Put this on pause for a second. Water or nothing.
Maybe water would be all right.
Yeah. Eric,
Okay.
stay on the mic a little closer.
Go a little closer?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're
No, my apologies for that. I know where we left off was kind of like pretty heavy. I mean, and it's not, it wouldn't be right just to kind of leave the story at that point, or this conversation. So when I was talking earlier about Indigenous people, we don't have a monopoly on this relationship. Is that somehow, just because humanities live so much of their existence on the land, that much of what we're about is always connecting to it in ways that we may not really even fully understand or even fully appreciate. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to these older groups, and they were really interested in terms of understanding dreaming and trying to say, well, what's the Indigenous outlook on that? And so I was sharing a number of stories, and I'll share those with you. The first one is with this. I was working on the Convention on Biodiversity, which is kind of like an international document. Because I worked at the Assembly of First Nations at the time, my boss would say, listen, they got this workshop and stuff going on there. You better head on over there and find out what it is they're talking about. And, you know, what does that got to do with anything? And I said, okay, like, I'll go on down there. What it was Environment Canada was putting together a committee team, and they wanted to have Indigenous people involved in the committee and the Canadian delegation. So I get down there, and like there's a lot of people. There's like 500 people there, and I'm kind of standing at the back and not really quite sure what I'm supposed to be trying to do. Anyways, there's this guy that's doing the most of the speaking. You know, he's got a mustache on, and you know, and he's talking. He's got this nice business suit on, and you know, I'm kind of standing at the back, kind of looking at him and saying, I don't like that guy. I don't even know who he is. I don't like that guy. It sounds too smooth for me. And so, but I was listening to him. I was, anyways, he finished his talk, and I said, well, he sounds like a big wheel in whatever going on around here. He probably has a lot to do with it. And so I listen, I take off back to the office, and they said, well, how'd it go? I said, it went fine, you know, everything was good. And well, they said, well, there's a second one. He goes, like, when? I says, well, this time it's in Montreal. He said, you got to head over there in about a month's time. He said, may as well make your plans right now and head over, because you got to go there now. Now that you're on this committee, you got to go. I said, okay. So anyways, a month later, I'm in Montreal, and all I had was this hotel number, and this is such and such a guy will meet you there. I said, okay. So I get to Montreal about 7 o'clock at night. I get into the lobby of the hotel, and I'm saying, okay, I'm here. Then I see this guy coming out, and I start saying, oh, no. I said, there's that guy I don't like. That's who I have to meet with. And he comes out, and he introduces himself, and he says, listen, I'm expecting more and more people to come here. He says, let's sit at the front here. And he says, we can see them as they're coming into the lobby. That way we don't miss anybody. I said, okay, well, let's sit down. So let's have a pop and a Coke. And I find out that he's a really avid hunter and likes outdoor fishing and everything. He spent some years trapping. And I thought, well, you're the guy ain't so bad after all. But he says, while we're waiting here, Eric, he says, I know you're an Indigenous person. And he says, and I wanted to ask you about this thing that I'm dealing with. And I said, okay. And he says, well, I have this really dear friend. He says, he just lost his wife. And he says he's deeply depressed. He's deeply under a lot of stress right now. And I don't know what to do for him. He says, on top of that, he says, I've been having this dream about his wife. And he says, in the dream, he says, she's fine. Like, she's happy. She's radiant. Her eyes are sparkling. He says, I don't, my dilemma, he says, I don't know if I should tell him about this dream. I don't know if that me telling him would help him or even make him more depressed. And it just happened that I was talking to Elder before that, and that was one of the points that part of the conversation that we had. And I said, you know, when those spirits come to you, I said, they're not there to hurt you. They're there to help you. And I said, sometimes when it gets too heavy for you to see the spirit of your mom or your dad or someone lost one that you love and they disappear, he says some of their visit to you is so emotional that they know that you won't be able to handle it. So what they do is they pick somebody beside you to be that messenger for them. And he says what she's trying to do is she's chosen you to be the message bearer, that she's in a good place, that she's with her relatives, that she's happy, but she wants to know that you're okay too. And really that's what it's about, is you needing to know that your lost one is in a good place. They're happy. They're also, they need to know that you're going to be all right. Because if something happens and they know that you're too hurt, they'll take you with them. And he says, and that's what you don't want to happen, is that for them to live that life of misery. So they're there to help you to prevent that. He says that's what they're trying to do. So when I'm talking about, and so I said that was my advice to this person. And he's saying, well, and that was one of the first few times I started to realize that there's not a monopoly. We don't have a monopoly on this. There was another incident when I was down in San Francisco, and I gave again this kind of talk to well, it was in a residential treatment center, so they kind of couldn't go anywhere. So I had a captive audience, but there's this one gentleman that was in the crowd, and like he was a real Bible person, and so. Anyways, I gave this talk, and I was talking about sharing the same stories that I was sharing with you, and so I show up at the center first thing in the morning, and he was standing out in the opening area where the gate was, and he sees me coming through the gate, and he says, "Eric," he says, "you're just the guy I want to talk to." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Like, what's this about?" And he says, "You know, Eric," he says, "you know, I'm a Bible person. I get a lot of my teachings and other things out of the Bible." And he says, "But something happened to me last night." He says, "Somehow the good book doesn't cover it. It doesn't explain it." He says, "But the talk that you gave yesterday gives me something to work with." And he says, "That's what happened to me last night." So anyways, when I came into the courtroom, he was standing in the middle, and he was clenching his fists like he was right on me, like he was emotional, like charged. And we had this conversation, and I said, well, what happened? He says, last night, he says, my grandmother and my mom visited me. I go, yeah? I said, well, what did he say to you? And he says, my grandma started talking first. And she says, you're thinking about killing yourself, aren't you? She said, you better stop thinking like that. You got a little girl and she's depending on you. He says, you stop thinking, you start thinking differently about stuff. And he says, and then my mom was there and she was saying, that's right, you do right by that little girl. He says, she's going to need you. She's going to need to depend on you. And then he says, nobody can tell me that was not my mom and my grandma and my mom that was with me last night or this morning. He says, that was them. I know that was them. And he says, I'm just standing out here this morning trying to make sense of it. So, again, it's not a monopoly. Indigenous people don't have a monopoly on it. We may just have a little more memory to work with in terms of understanding what is this relationship that humanity has, not only with each other, the land has something to do with it as well. I'll finish off with one other story. This one's more with my dad and my older sister. My dad had passed, and I guess I share this just to give more to work with for people. Is my dad had passed, and in our teachings, he will go around and visit that person. Will visit each one of the family members or people that were significant in that person's life. So he visited me, he visited my sisters. There are all different stories that we have of what he had to say. Anyways, he visits my mom and my sister. My sister was in her bed, and she could hear the floor creak the way it does in her room. And she says, and then she opened her eyes and she says, Dad was standing there. And he holds out his hand and he says, I want you to come with me. He says, I have something I want to show you. And she gets scared and she says, no, you're dead. I'm not supposed to go with you. And he smiles at her and he says, his eyes are twinkling, like they're black or they're just shining. She said, it's okay, sweetheart. He says, I'll bring you back. And so she reaches out, she grabs his hand, and he says, the next thing is that they're walking, and he says, inside this area, and he says, there's some people that are in uniform, like soldier uniforms. There's other people who have bush jackets on, and he says, we're walking through them, and it's kind of like a mist, and they're just kind of coming into focus as we're walking. And my dad is looking at her, and he says, these are all the people that I've loved in my life. And he says, and all of them are here. All these people are with me. All the ones that I've had a loving relationship with. He says that they're all here. And then he turns around and he looks at her and he says, I have to take you back now. And so she says she's laying in bed, and he says he's standing over her and he's looking at her. And he says, Sherry, he says, out of all the things I told you, in life, he says, I want you to remember this. You only lose freedom when you close your mind. And then he said he was gone. And then she said she woke up and she said, man, that was like such a powerful message that he delivered. And I think that I would stop there and I said, that's something that all of us are struggling with. We close our mind to certain things, and we lose the freedom of possibilities, or the freedom, we lose freedom, the ability to accommodate each other, the ability to know the world differently, to the possibilities of interpreting our direction and our experiences in the world. We lose those opportunities. So I'll bring it to a full stop and leave it for people to have questions if they wish to have questions. I want to make sure I left some time for that this afternoon.
Questions or comments? So you spoke about I'll try to be loud. You spoke about your experience working on issues of biodiversity with members of the federal government. Did you find that there was a freedom of thought and an open mind in that forum where people were willing to look at other ideas? It's a big question.
It's there's so many ways I can answer that in terms of how far back do we want to go? Do we want to go back to the Magna Carta in England? And not very many people know that there was two Magna Cartas. There was the one that Robin Hood fought for, but there was another Magna Carta that had to deal with the forest, and that was for the public to have gathering rights in medicinal firewood, fish, other animals, and that's kind of like does not hand the king's deer that you're hunting. You can't do that. And even if you didn't like Robin, some of the facts kind of hold up in terms of what was going on in the world, in that society, in that time, and with people. At the bottom of it is people. People are part of that. People wanting to have that relationship, that connection. You get the idea of people closing off certain areas of the land, taking those lands out of the public's reach, and you find this logic. There's always an attempt being made for that to be the logic in terms of what our relationship not only is among ourselves, but in terms of relationships with the land. And so when you talk about the sovereignty of the province or the sovereignty of Canada, or you talk about the sovereignty of the British Crown, you kind of have to say, well, you get this sovereignty by a military solution, you get this sovereignty by a papal bull that's giving you some kind of right to the land. Is that kind of what's going on here? Because it's not only is the idea of land relationship incompatible, the spirituality is also incompatible. That's giving rise to this situation that's powering this situation and this relationship that exists between Indigenous people and other people. The only one who really has sovereignty, if I had to really hardly be pressed for it, is nature. Nature does not need us. It will, long after we're gone, its sovereignty will continue. We have, Indigenous people have a relationship by ceremony, by other relationships that we try to interact with that sovereignty. But we totally understand our existence, both physically and spiritually, in terms of knowing the Creator, knowing that it is totally on the land. It's through all those different members of, when I was talking about earlier about Indigenous people being named, and I started this session off with a naming song. Everybody would say, well, how does that happen? How can nature name? So when the Anishinaabe went out and named the different animals of the earth, and then he found at the end of that journey that he was the one without a name. And that's when nature stepped forward and said, we'll name you, we'll give you a name, and we'll give you a place so that you know your place and you can explain your existence in this thing we're experiencing. And so you just kind of stand back. And if you're working earlier with some of these logics, is that, well, how does that happen? Like, how can that happen? How can nature come and name something? So it starts off with an explanation that children, as they are coming out of the spirit world, elders are about to go into the spirit world. And so they're the closest to each other. That's why the elders get to name the children and give them their spirit names. But you also, when elders have these naming dreams, that, and I'll give you another story, that the elder I was with, he says, I was walking along this path in this dream. I was walking along this pathway, and he says, "What's that path?" And like I said, I knew it was well. He says, come down the hill. He says, there's this bear, and he says it's coming down full speed down this hill. It hits the same path that I'm on, and then it turns and it starts coming up the path that I'm on. He says, I start getting scared. He says, he felt this little tugging on the side of his shirt. So I turned around, I looked down, and he said, there's my godchild, little girl, and she's standing there, and he's saying, like, what are you doing here? He says, there's a bear coming down this road here. And she holds up a sucker, and she holds up to him. And he's looking at it, and she walks to the side of the road, and she says, there's a ceremony going on there. There's fruit, rice, meat, he says, and she goes and puts that little offering beside that, on that table. And then he says, and then he remembered the bear, and he says, he looks, and he says that bear is right in front of him now, and it stands up, and it turns into this older woman. And then the older woman starts singing, Should have went a little bit higher. Ogegagi kwe, ogegagi kwe, hey, hey, hey. So he's finished singing that song for him. And what they're saying in that song is forever woman. And so he says the lady turns around. He says there's other things inside that dream. He says, but she starts to walk back and then she starts to charge up the hill again. And he says, not like an old woman trying to get up the hill. He says, like she was like powerful, like just like an athlete going straight up. And then just before she jumped back over the ridge again, she turned back into a bear. And he says, and I woke up in my bed. And he says, in our tradition, we have our hand drums right above our heads. He says, so I grabbed my hand drum. And I started singing that song. And I started singing that song so that I would commit it to memory forever, as that's what the gift was. Anyways, he goes back to bed. Next morning, here's a knock on his door. And he says, and there's my nephew. And he invites him, come on, let's have a cup of coffee. And he says they're talking and joking and telling silly stories. And finally, he says his nephew pushes this pouch of tobacco across the table. He says, I want you to name my daughter. And then, as an Alex says, that's when I knew that your girl's name is going to be Forever Woman. She's claimed by the bears. These are her colors. These are the songs. This is her song. This is what she can use to when she calls for help. This is that relation. This is how nature names the Anishinaabe. So you end up with this. So it kind of circles back to why I structured the talk that I did today, was to talk about examining the European worldview, what shaped that, before we started talking about the Indigenous worldview, because even though this stuff really sounds trippy and stuff, it would even sound more trippy if I didn't go through some of these other explanations first. Anyways, I hope that kind of long-winded explanation. That's what my wife tells me too.
Other questions or comments? I know we're on time now, but last thoughts? You want to open up a line?
I know it's wondering, it leads you to wonder, because this stuff is so different. Not, almost like on a road less traveled. Like it's people need time to really kind of hear it and then compare it to all their other thoughts, all the other pieces of information that they had, to say, like, what would be a good question here at this point? And so don't feel awkwardness to say, this is, like, believe me, when those things were happening, it was the darndest thing. I have no idea. Anyways.
So Eric, I hope you don't mind if I stand next to here. So first of all, I'm glad to hear, you finished by saying some of these things sound very different, but there's a lot that sounded very similar. And I'm glad to hear that when you mentioned about working up in Kenora in minus 40-degree weather and your spit turning to ice immediately, it sounded like my father's stories. He's from Winnipeg, about minus 40-degree stories as well. But that's, on a serious note, I found, I think a lot of us are a little overwhelmed with the expansive nature of your description of how we understand our place in this world, and how, in many ways, we come from different places, but in many ways, the way we see the world is incredibly similar. I made all sorts of notes about points of contact between our cultures, our ideologies, and our experience. And I think the Jewish perspective, which is what I would choose to speak about at this point. There are many ways that we share ideas and experiences. And I think a lot of what shapes the way we think today is we've kind of strayed from some of the things that we began with at the beginning of our civilization and of our experience. And you spoke a lot about the land. And in our tradition, next week we're going to read a portion from the Bible that deals with creation, the first part of the Bible. And one of the things that it grants us as human beings is that our task here is as custodians. We are here, in the words of the Bible, in the Hebrew, le'ovda u'leshamra. We are here to work it, but to preserve it. It is not our task to own it and to decide who gets to share it. It's for everyone to share. And I think over the centuries, we've kind of forgotten that message. We read it every year, but we don't really go back and try to understand how that can apply to our lives. And I want to thank you for bringing up all these various points that challenge us to explore a little bit about where we have come from and how much we really share in common with Indigenous culture and Indigenous ideas. And one thing I want to share with you is our connection with the land, although perhaps on Thanksgiving is a little bit contrived here in Canada. We have a very powerful connection with the land in Israel. And we often talk about the elements of the land, the fruits of the land, the various benefits that we can enjoy from the land. That's part of our culture and part of this time of year as well. And for that reason, I'm just going to call upon Corinne for a moment to offer you a gift of our connection with the land.
Sure. So I'm actually going to read what I wrote because Michael asked me to. So first of all, we want to thank you for coming, for your teaching, storytelling, songs, and drumming. And we hope this is the beginning, very beginning, of a beautiful relationship between our two communities. But we're right now in celebrating the Harvest Festival, Sukkah, and we wanted to share with you the traditional 7 species. So my attempt to find all the 7 species, this is what it is here, will let you take it home with you. But I thought I'd just explain what they were. So they're primarily harvested in the land of Israel, but there's wheat. So that we have also a traditional bread that we eat on the Sabbath, and it's to represent kindness. There's barley, which I couldn't find a really good, so there's just a little bit of barley. I don't know what you're going to do with it in a pretty bag, but it's for restraint. They're grapes. They're Canadian, not Israeli, so they're safe to eat right now, and that's harmony. Figs over here, which is perseverance and endurance. There's a pomegranate back there, which is for humility. Olives over there, which is the foundation. And dates over here, which is the kingdom. So each of the 7 species contains very deep lessons for us about our spiritual lives. And every time we eat them, we have the opportunity to bring the world a step closer to a better state than it is right now. And we also wanted to give you a little jar of honey because we just celebrated our new year a couple weeks ago, and we want to wish you a very sweet year. And of course, we just want to thank you. So in Hebrew, it's Toda, and if I say it right, in English. Thank you so much. This is a way for you. And hopefully you can take that home and share with your wife. Okay.
Before I share one final word for you, Eric, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Marcia and Corinne for the tremendous amount of work and for the entire committee in organizing this, arranging with you this wonderful encounter to give us a better insight about some of the aspects of the Indigenous experience as well as culture. The last thing I want to share with you, for us, ceremony and song are very significant as well. And this time of year on the Sukkah festival, we gather 4 different species together. I won't go into the symbolism of each of the species, that in itself is an hour lecture. And people have been very patient with me so far. But what I want to do with you, I just want to go through a ceremony with you, because some of the things you said today gave me an additional perspective on what the meaning of this ceremony can be. When we shake these four things together, these four items together, they're supposed to represent four different types of personalities and the idea of bringing people together, and that's why we hold them all together. But we don't just hold them, we shake them in 6 different directions. And we shake them, they're different customs, and we don't often take the trouble to do it as we really should. So the tradition that I learned is when you shake them in each direction, you don't just shake it. You shake it and bring it in towards you 3 times in each direction. So first we do, depending when you're facing, in this direction 3 times. So now I've done the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. And the way I perceive that, in light of some of the things you say, we're looking around who our neighbors are, who is here. We want to invite them all to gather in the Sukkah, and that's what this festival is about, the opportunity to gather people together. But then we have 2 additional directions in which we shake it. And we raise it up to the heavens and bring it down 3 times as well. And in light of some of the things you said, the additional perception I have of that is that we're talking about not just what's here around us and then the people we see in the present, but perhaps the spirits, those who are no longer with us, wanting to engage with them, to invite them to join us as well. And lastly, we reach down to the ground and bring that up 3 times. And your talk about this connection that we need to have with the land, for me, that's what this is about as well. We can look around, see everyone around us. We can think of generations in the past from different spirits. But at the same time, we're here grounded in a specific place. And by reaching down towards the ground, we need to be aware of who lives on that ground now and with whom we can share that. And the idea of Sukkot is to gather people together. There's a saying that says, Kol Yisrael Ru'im Le'shev B'Sukkah Achat. All Israel is worthy of sitting in one Sukkah, whereas everybody has their own. We only need one Sukkah to bring everyone together. And when I say all of Israel, of course, I mean all of humanity. Our challenge is to be able to engage with others, to find out what we can learn, those who came before, those who live in different places, and those who live a different, perhaps what we might consider a different worldview, but to explore how much we may have in common with that worldview and to continue to engage with one another in a constructive, effective, dignified, and respectful way. And I thank you for sharing everything you have today, for helping us to do that from our own perspective. So, miigwech. Toda rabah. Thank you very much. And I did warn you in advance that I was going to ask you to teach me something. When we're finished meeting with somebody, we don't say just goodbye or thank you. We say lehitraot, until we meet again. So in your language, how would I say that? Until the next time we meet.
Yeah, Bamapi Guabman.
Bamabi Guaban?
Bamapi Guabman.
Bamapi Guaban.
Yeah.
Okay, can everyone say that?
Bamapi Guabman.
So we look forward to the next chance to engage with you, Eric. Thank you so much. Miigwech.
We started with a song. I'll end with a song.
That would be great. You want me to turn off the recording?
Yes, please.